What is going on, guys? Welcome back to the channel, and today we're going to be doing another updated hero guide, this time focusing on probably my favourite new character from the sequel trilogy, which is KYLO REN. Now, similar to what I said in the Han Solo guide that I put up the other day, KYLO hasn't really changed dramatically since launch. He's always been fairly balanced, so they haven't really had to change too much about him. However, he is the slightest bit underpowered, at least in my opinion. So I would love for them to give him just the slightest buff at some point, although for the most part he's not too bad. He definitely could be a lot worse, so I'm not going to complain too much. So in these guides I do cover both Galactic Assault and the Heroes vs Villain game modes as well, so I'll separate both game modes and touch on both the best star cards to use and the best tactics to use in each game mode as well. Before I get stuck into that though, I'll just quickly touch on KYLO's HP and abilities just so that any newer players out there can get a good idea of how he plays. So he starts off with a base HP of 750, which is about the average for a Saber user in Battlefront 2, however he doesn't have any form of health regen star card, so even though his base HP is relatively normal, he does actually seem to lack a bit when it comes to his health. Now, in saying that, he can regen 250 HP, which is a bit higher than most of the blaster heroes in the game. As for his speed, he comes in at 4th place out of the 6 Saber heroes, with Rey, Luke and Maul all being a tiny bit faster than him. However, he's still a lot quicker than Yoda and Darth Vader, so he definitely isn't slow by any means. Similar to the other Saber users in the game, he does have a force jump as well, which I'm sure you all know by now is just done by holding down the jump button rather than pressing it. And for any of you guys that have watched my Luke hero guide as well, you can actually make him jump the tiniest bit further if you use his R1 ability in mid-air. Now for Luke, this actually makes him go the slightest bit higher, but for KYLO it actually just makes him go the slightest bit further forward rather than going any higher than the normal jump. This is an awesome tip to use if you think you need to jump across a gap that you might not be able to make the distance, or even just to jump and then use the freeze ability in mid-air to freeze your opponent, and then you'll land further away from them, which can obviously help you run to safety just a little bit easier. Now, his weapon of choice is obviously his custom cross-bladed lightsaber, which I personally think is one of the best looking sabers out there, and although he does have a slightly slower swing speed than most of the other saber users, he does also deal a tiny bit more damage than most others as well. So that probably ends up giving him a slight disadvantage in Galactic Assault, but also a slight advantage in HVV and Hero Showdown. So now moving on to his abilities, and to be honest, he actually has a fairly decent set of abilities that can all be used really well in combination to help you get some of those longer kill streaks that we're all striving for. His L1 ability is called Pull, and this causes KYLO to use the Force to pull anyone within the area of effect off their feet and pretty much land right in front of KYLO, which majority of the time is pretty much just going to leave them completely defenseless. Now keep in mind that it won't always make them land right next to you. Sometimes they might only be pulled forward slightly, or sometimes they might actually end up going all the way past you. But for the most part, this is just going to pull them somewhat towards you and leaving you with pretty much an almost guaranteed kill. His L1R1 ability is called Frenzy, and this is pretty much just the equivalent of an aimbot for KYLO's lightsaber. Now what this does is it pretty much just automatically swings and aims your lightsaber when you use the ability, so effectively you can just press L1 and R1 and then pretty much take your hands off the controller and it'll just do all the work for you for a few seconds. This ability does seem to be pretty handy, more so in HVV and Showdown, but it does work pretty well in Galactic Assault too. You just need to make sure you're close enough to the enemy to use it, as sometimes it can send you lunging forward only to end up standing still if there's no one close enough to attack, which can actually leave you a little bit vulnerable to attack yourself. His R1 ability is called Freeze, and exactly as this sounds, it just freezes anyone within the area of effect for a few seconds, leaving them completely defenseless and unable to move. Now what a lot of people do seem to forget with this ability is that when you freeze someone, as soon as they're hit once with a lightsaber, they actually break out of the lock and are able to move again. If you shoot them with a blaster, however, they'll actually stay frozen in place, which means you can just completely take them out without them having a chance to fight back. About 90% of the time when I use this ability on an enemy hero, I'll actually just leave them frozen and let someone else on my team take them out with their blaster, rather than hitting them myself and then breaking them out of their frozen state. On regular infantry, I tend to attack them more often as they usually won't have time to fight back anyway, but just keep in mind that if you do freeze a hero or an enforcer for example, it's actually best not to attack them and just to let your teammates worry about getting the kill instead. So that's pretty much all of the base tips covered. Now we're going to move on to some of the best tips to use when it comes to Galactic Assault. So to start off, I'm just going to go through some of his best star cards to use in Galactic Assault, and honestly he's one of the few characters in the game where nearly every single star card is a viable option depending on what mode you're playing or what your playstyle is. Now, because I can't manage to cram every single star card into such a short video, I'm going to just pick the 4 cards that I think are his best and explain what they do, and then I'll do the same for the hero game modes as well. So if I do miss any cards that you guys think are worth mentioning, then don't hesitate to let everyone know down in the comments section. So the first card I'm going to recommend for Galactic Assault is his Harsh Pull card, and this makes it so that you can actually deal damage to enemies when they get pulled towards you. Fully upgraded, this card deals 50 damage to anyone, so that means that any other class in the heavy will become a one-hit kill once they've been hit with your pull ability. If you can manage to pull 4 or 5 enemies towards you, then you can easily take them all out without any problems, and it pretty much cuts the time to kill in half, as you'll only have to swing the saber 5 times instead of 10, which is super handy, especially when there are so many enemies nearby. The next card I'm going to recommend is his Power Reach card, which pretty much just directly relates to the last card that I mentioned as well. Now this card increases the area of effect of the pull ability, so this in combination with the last card I mentioned means you'll be able to pull more enemies towards you and then also take them out in half the time as well. So if you're going to be going after some big kill streaks, then these 2 cards combined can really help speed up that process. The third card I'm going to recommend for Galactic Assault is his Bloodlust card, which increases the amount of times he can attack when you use the Frenzy ability. Now on its own, this card is super useful for taking out groups of enemies at once, but it also works super well with the 2 cards that I just mentioned as well. In that situation where you've pulled 4 or 5 enemies towards you and then also dealt 50 damage from the pull, if you use the Frenzy ability straight away with this card, then you're going to be able to pretty much take the whole group out without any issues at all, as the Frenzy ability is pretty much just going to do all the work for you. Now for the 4th and final card, I'm going to recommend his Berserking Tantrum star card. Now what this does is it effectively lowers the stamina drain for every saber strike, meaning you can take out a few more enemies before you run out of stamina, or it even just allows you to have more stamina left over for blocking after you've taken out a few enemies with your saber. With the recent changes to the stamina system, this is a really useful card to use, and it can definitely be a lifesaver if you can save a little bit of stamina to help protect yourself from the enemy blasters, so this is definitely another awesome card to use. So now moving on to some tips for Galactic Assault, and I definitely have to recommend that you try to play a similar style to Luke Skywalker, in that you don't want to go rushing into the fight, rather taking a step back and trying to separate the enemies from each other, so that you can take them out 1 or 2 at a time rather than a whole bunch all at once. If there are a bunch of enemies in a hallway, for example, I like to try and use the pull ability to separate a few of them and drag them towards me, letting me take them out without all the other enemies having line of sight of me at the same time and leaving me exposed to enemy fire. Try to stay out of the main action as much as possible when there are too many enemies around, because as I mentioned earlier, his health just really isn't high enough to be able to walk around like Vader and just be a tank, so play to your strengths and try and play a bit more of a smarter game rather than an aggressive game. So that's pretty much all of the tips for Galactic Assault. Now we're going to move on to some of the best star cards to use in the Heroes vs Villain game modes. So the first card I'm going to recommend is his Resilience star card, which just makes it so that whenever you're within close proximity of one of your teammates, you'll deal more damage with the saber. So this one is really handy for obvious reasons, and it is pretty self-explanatory. The next card I'm going to recommend is his Bloodletting Frenzy card, and this makes it so that when your health is below 25%, you'll actually deal more damage with the saber as well, which is so useful in these hero game modes. I couldn't tell you how many times this has saved my life when I'm down around the 100 HP mark. It gives you such a huge advantage in those close battles, so this is definitely one that I recommend using at all times in HVV and Hero Showdown. The third card I'm going to recommend is his Power Reach card, which I already mentioned for Galactic Assault, and this is the one that just increases the area of effect for the pull ability. This is super helpful for catching any runners or even any blaster users that are keeping their distance, as it just allows you to pull enemies towards you from much further away. The fourth and final card I'm going to recommend is another one that I already mentioned for Galactic Assault, which is the Bloodlust card. This is the one that allows more attacks for the Frenzy ability, and I find this to be so useful for taking out blaster heroes who just can't defend themselves from these attacks. And usually with this card, if you've got them down to around half their health, you can pretty much just take them out just from the Frenzy ability, which is obviously super handy. So now moving on to the tips for these game modes, and the main one I have is just to try and be as much of a team player as you possibly can. As I mentioned before, if you use the freeze ability and then leave it to one of your blaster using teammates to take the enemy out without a fight, and then you can just try and use the pull ability as often as possible to get the enemy off their feet as well. KYLO's definitely up there with one of the more useful characters in these game modes, but it's all about playing smart rather than playing too aggressively. If you make the most of your abilities and only attack when you have an advantage, you can just about be unstoppable, and you can easily play the objective better than any other character when it comes to HVV. So that's going to be it for our updated KYLO guide, guys. Hopefully some of these tips helped you out, and if they did, then make sure to leave a like down below to help support the channel. Like I mentioned before, if you do have any tips of your own, then definitely don't hesitate to leave a comment and let everyone know. The more tips the better, so definitely feel free to leave your own tips as well. If you are new to the channel, then feel free to subscribe and make sure to turn on your notifications so you don't miss out on any Battlefront 2 guides or live streams. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll catch you all in the next one.